Hey, so you know what I found to not be fun? Arguing. So much so, I compiled a list of all the things that aren't worth arguing about. As it turns out, for me, there's nothing that is. Well, almost nothing. Tends to just make everyone angry and never change anybody's mind. I got more productive things to do, like engage in a polite and respectful two-way conversation. Now we're talking. And for today's candidates, we have the Nintendo Entertainment System and PlayStation 1. Which console was more impactful? The little gray box that could, or the other little gray box that could? And when it comes to two-way conversations, it doesn't get any more polite and respectful than having one with yourself. I do it all the time. Now, right off the bat, many folks might be thinking, this is an easy question. It's obviously the Nintendo Entertainment System because it saved the home video game console market in the US. That's the part people forget. Remember, the NES wasn't really a big seller outside of the US and Japan. Naturally, lots of people have a counter argument to this, which I'm paraphrasing, but it goes something along the lines of, who cares? Well, call me crazy, but it seems like being impactful in the entire world should count for something. That said, I think the case could be made that the NES did impact the entire world, if perhaps in a more indirect way. Because the US market is such a huge market and the Nintendo Entertainment System revitalized it in such a major way, it paved the path for home consoles to become popular again, and that popularity was so massive that it would eventually spread to other parts of the world. And let's focus on our good friends in Europe for just a minute. You see, during the reign of the NES, playing video games on various computer systems was more popular than gaming on home consoles over there. In fact, they didn't really have a video game crash like we did, so the NES wasn't as big of a deal to them as it was to us in the US. It just wasn't, not even close. Heck, when it came to home consoles, even the Sega Master System was much more popular than the NES over there. That said, the overwhelming success of the NES in the places where it was popular was building a snowball of momentum for Nintendo as a brand and home consoles in general, and that snowball was headed for Europe eventually. So maybe their reaction to the NES was, but then their reaction to the Super Nintendo was slightly more enthusiastic, and then continued to grow even further with the PlayStation 1. When the PlayStation 1 came along, its sales numbers were monstrous, especially at the time compared to everything else. A big part of why the sales numbers were so big is because it sold really well all over the world, including Europe, where it was easily the best-selling home console they ever had at the time. And it still ranks pretty high even all these years later. To put things into perspective, the NES sold roughly 60 million units, whereas the PlayStation 1 sold roughly 100 million units. Sure, part of that discrepancy is because the gaming market simply wasn't as big in the mid-80s as it was by the mid to late 90s, but the PlayStation 1 is what made the gaming market so much bigger. But here's where things get kind of interesting. People like to credit the NES for the fact that the PlayStation 1 even exists, and you know what? It's hard to deny that Sony was influenced by Nintendo to get into the video game market, and perhaps there's no greater evidence of this than the fact they initially wanted to partner with Nintendo. Even had that now famous Nintendo PlayStation prototype that was discovered. Nintendo had proven themselves, and Sony felt it would be less risky to partner with Nintendo than it would be to go out on their own or partner with somebody else. But when that partnership infamously fell through, that was no longer an option, and they eventually decided to go it alone when they could have just said to heck with it. I'm just not so sure I agree with the idea that the NES is automatically more impactful than everything that came after it because it came before them, although don't get me wrong, that is still very important. I mean, the Magnavox Odyssey gets much deserved credit for being the first home game console, but pretty much everybody agrees that the NES was more impactful, even though it came after, because it did way more. So coming earlier is an important factor, but not the only factor, and there's a balance to how far you can take it. I mean, would it make sense to give all the credit for my YouTube channel to my dad? Well, I might because I love my dad, but you get my point. As far as whether or not the NES saved home consoles, it can be hard to say whether or not another home video game console would have come along and revitalized the market the way the NES did if the NES had never come out. But if you believe no console would have, well, that's pretty hard to argue against. As a bit of a side note, I do feel I should point out that saying something is more impactful doesn't necessarily mean you're saying it's better. Quick little example for you. The other day I'm chomping on a nanner, and as you would expect, I'm having a great time. Well, I get carried away, I get cocky, and bit my tongue. Ooh, baby, did that hurt. So I would consider eating the banana to have been way better, but biting my tongue was certainly more impactful. So it's possible to like the NES more than the PS1, but think the PS1 is more impactful, and vice versa. I think when people see a question like this, they sometimes just immediately think, impactful? That sounds like a good thing. Well, here we go, whatever console I like. When I smash this gamepad over your head, it'll be impactful. Both of these consoles could have been impactful in ways that you don't necessarily like. I mean, the PlayStation is often credited for shifting the focus of video games away from gameplay and more towards gameplay and cutscenes, which could be considered either a good or bad thing by people. Either way, it's a big shift for video games. The PlayStation also often gets credited with expanding the demographic of people who play video games, with the most obvious addition being older people, but perhaps more interestingly, the people who thought video games were only for dorks or nerds, which maybe people still think video games are only for dorks or nerds, but being a dork or a nerd is now a good thing. In any case, depending what your school and neighborhood were like back in the day, and depending which year back in the day would be for you, you may not have had this issue. But there was a time where a stigma existed against playing video games, and I'm not talking about parents who want you to get your butt outside and enjoy the sunshine, which nowadays, you have parents telling their kids to get their butts inside to play some retro video games with them. Good job, Mom and Dad. But no, I'm talking about how back in the day, there was a stigma against playing video games, even amongst kids, in a lot of cases teenagers. And funny enough, some of the exact same kids who used to bully or make fun of kids at school for playing Nintendo games may very well have gone on to play games like Metal Gear Solid or Resident Evil on PlayStation, but while still making fun of those who were playing Nintendo games. That's the ironic part of it. The stigma of video games being uncool was both eradicated by the PlayStation as well as propagated by it in many ways. Started by the US marketing department with the Sega Genesis before it, the formula had been created that you could turn people against Nintendo by simply saying their games were more childish and less cool. Imagine that. You could make something uncool by just saying that's the case. Worked on humans too. I'm not still bitter. But yeah, even though Nintendo was considered cool in many circles, in others it was not. Heck, saying Nintendo is too childish/uncool is still a thing to this day, though it's not really anybody's marketing department doing it nowadays. But at the time, Sony didn't care if people thought video games were uncool, so long as it wasn't the video games on the PlayStation, just games found on their competitors' systems. In fact, it was ideal, exactly what you would need to happen in order to dominate. And as far as sales go that generation, the PlayStation absolutely was dominant. And with such domination, certain trends were set into motion. Older gamers were now being targeted more than ever, and very successfully, even with games like RPGs. The types of games that would appear on PlayStation, as well as simply how it was marketed, created a trickle-down effect that basically covered everyone. The games would appeal to adults, teenagers, older kids, and any younger kids with "I'm a big kid now" aspirations would naturally want to play what older kids thought was cool. I know I did in certain situations, and a lot of you did as well. Kind of ironic considering now that we're really big kids, we want to do stuff that younger people do, like playing video games and not being old. The PlayStation was also a big factor in leading the charge from 2D games to 3D games. But while the PlayStation impacted what type of games were being made in a significant way, I'd argue that the NES did as well. In my opinion, the NES is what pushed video games past a lot of the more restrictive design elements of arcade games, with perhaps one of the more notable ones being single-screen games. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories of people whose first experience playing NES games was along the lines of, "Oh my goodness, the screen just keeps scrolling and new stuff keeps coming onto screen." Not that single-screen arcade games aren't still awesome in their own way, and because of those fixed screens that offer certain advantages, but this was a big change for video games, and sure, there were games where the screen scrolled before the NES, but the NES is what really popularized it on home consoles, in my opinion. Not to mention the popularization of the D-pad, bunch of big-time franchises, all that good stuff. So I feel the PlayStation and Nintendo Entertainment System both had an impact on what video games themselves would become. But like I said before, the PS1 was more of a global success than any console to come before it, and for that reason, along with some of the others I've discussed, my personal answer would be the PlayStation as the more impactful console, which, if you watched my video on the 5 most impactful consoles, you already knew I thought that. I just felt the comparison between the NES and PlayStation deserved a deeper look. That said, I totally understand why people would argue for the NES, even taking into account the factor of the two consoles' global impact, since Nintendo as a brand would eventually make its way to the entire world, and the NES is what got that momentum started. I would be curious though, is anybody arguing in favor of the NES not from North America? I'd be really curious to hear somebody's perspective who fits that description, and hey, no liars about where you're from, we'll be able to tell. But in any case, I'd love to hear what anybody has to say on the subject, as always. Oh, but please don't feel the need to rage in the comments to be noticed. I promise I will still read your comment, even if it's written politely. In fact, I'll be more likely to. So with that, leave your thoughts down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's